In today's video, I'm going to take you behind the scenes of a Valentine's Day beauty shoot. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here, and if you follow me on social media, you can see that I love to create timely, thematic images for the holidays. And I do it for every holiday. For Valentine's Day, 4th of July, for Halloween, for Christmas. And I do this for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that I love to collaborate with my creative team and just create fun images that we love to share. But it's also really useful to create eye-catching imagery that is timely to this season. Now, for this particular Valentine's Day beauty shoot, I am bringing out all of the creative stops. We're going to be playing around with unusual light modifiers, color grading, creative filters, reflections, and all of that. And so there are many things that are going to go into the making of this image, which is why I'm going to break it down piece by piece. When you see it all together, it can definitely be overwhelming. But if you see how every element contributes and adds something to the equation, it makes it much easier to understand, makes it much more accessible. Now, I want to begin with the concept of this shoot. My wardrobe stylist pulled this gorgeous dress, and so we decided it'd be fun to play around with both reflections and the color pink, because the outfit has reflections on it, and then of course the pink of the heart. And so we began with our set, which is a Savage Universal coral background. It's this beautiful desaturated pink that would help reinforce the color theory that we're going for. And then, because I liked the idea of reflections, I took a rose gold mirrored piece of plexiglass, put it on a posing table in front of the subject, and that's going to give her something to interact with, to play with. So not only will it anchor her in the scene, but it'll also give us something visually interesting, another reflection. And so that is the very basis, the key elements of the photograph. But now I want to talk a little bit about lighting, and then we're going to get into some of the creative effects. For this shoot, I'm going to be using 3 different strobes. But I want to begin by talking about our main light over here to the right-hand side of the frame. On it, I am using my favorite modifier, which is the Westcott optical spot. I love this modifier because it allows me to have so much control over light, more than I can get with pretty much any other modifier. How we're using it today is to create a tight slice of light on the subject's face. And so I've used the leaves in the modifier itself, closed it down, and there's just a beam of light on her face. So I want to show you what that looks like with just only that first strobe. And the hands right there, that's perfect. All right, so far we just have the optical spot, slice of light on the face, and the image, it doesn't look like much at all. It's definitely not particularly interesting because there's no other light hitting any part of the frame. I told you that the reflection is meant to be interesting and the color of the background, but right now that's all falling to shadow. So that is why I'm going to build in additional lights. Let's begin by adding our background light as the second strobe. Now, I am once again using another Westcott optical spot. So I mentioned one way you can use this modifier is to create slices or beams of light. But another way is you can use it to project patterns onto your subject and background. And I happen to have the perfect shape. It's called the gobo, a go-between optic. You put that into the modifier, you can project it onto the scene, and for Valentine's Day, of course, it makes sense that I am using a heart. And so I'm going to use this to illuminate the background, not only to reinforce the theme of Valentine's Day, but also to create a bit of separation. So over here, left-hand side of the frame, I have that pointed behind her, and it's quite a bit of distance away from the background, and that is to allow the heart to be larger. Now when I shoot, I can vary the distance. I can bring it in close to the background to make the heart smaller, or I can pull it away if I want to increase the size. Of course, doing so, I'm going to need to adjust the power to make the heart brighter or darker. All right, so let's just add the heart behind her for that background light. All right, so this is starting to get a bit more interesting and reinforce that Valentine's Day theme, but my vision was not something this dark and dramatic. I absolutely wanted to have more detail in the color of the background or in her dress. Right now, I basically can't see the dress at all, which is where we're adding our third and final strobe. Right here, I'm adding a ProPhoto D2 with no modifier on it at all. But you'll notice it's not even pointed at the scene. It's pointed back to the corner of the room. And what I'm doing is I'm bouncing it off of the wall behind me, as well as the ceiling. It's going to bounce off, and because it's traveling over such a long distance, it spreads out everywhere, and all that does is it lifts up the shadows. It creates something that's omnidirectional. In other words, it's not coming from one direction, and therefore it won't create any distracting shadows. It's also nice because I don't even need a modifier. I just point it in the corner of the room for bounce. So that is going to be our third strobe, and let me show you what it adds to the equation. As you can see, this adds a great deal of detail into the shadow areas. If I want more fill and I want it to be brighter, maybe more ethereal or playful, I can turn up the power of this light. And if I want these shadows to be darker and a little richer, I simply turn down the power. So I like the control that I have there. So now that we have the lighting in place, we have the core elements working together, now it's time for the additional dashes of creativity. And I'm going to do so in several ways. Now, first of all, I want to play around with creative filters, a creative in-camera effect. I'm going to be using something called a star filter. And if you follow me online, you can see this is one of my favorite things to do anytime there are rhinestones or reflection or bling. And what happens is when hard light, like the optical spot, hits one of those reflections, it will create a starburst effect. There are many different types of star filters. The one I'm going to be using for this shot is called a North Star filter. And what it'll do is it'll give me this beautiful pattern and reflection of light. Now, if I take a shot and you don't see the reflection, the subject may need to change the pose because it's all about the angle of reflection back towards the camera. So let's see what we're getting when we add that North Star filter. All right, so you can see how it is adding a star filter effect on the heart, which is one of the centers of interest for this image. So far, we have unusual modifiers, an unusual filter, we have reflections. So what else can I add to this equation? So I think the next part I'm going to add is going to be color grading. So let's pop over to Capture One and I'll show you some of the changes that I envision. All right, so now we're over here in Capture One and I'm going to begin with adjustments with both the white balance and the tint. I want to make this look a little vintagey and a little warmer, so I'm going to warm up the Kelvin temperature and then also grab the tint and make it a little bit more magenta. Now when I do this, the skin tone is perhaps not quite accurate, so one of the tricks I have when I'm messing around with white balance and tint is I tend to desaturate, and it makes something look a little bit more pastel and a little bit painterly. But when I desaturate, things often appear a little bit flat, lacking contrast. So I'm just going to compensate with a little bit more contrast. So let me show you what we have so far. This is before, this is after, and everything is just a little warmer, a little bit more pink, a little bit more painterly, but that wasn't really a dramatic effect. If I want to get more dramatic, I'm going to start to mess around with color balance. You're going to be looking for the color wheels. If you're in Lightroom or Capture One or Adobe Camera Raw, look for the area with the color wheel, and you can start to drag so that the highlights, midtones, and shadows have the exact color, the exact hues that you want. So let's say I want to really warm up the skin tone. Here in the highlights, I can drag this towards yellow and see how it starts to look kind of like old film, a little bit vintage. Then in the shadows, well, I said that I wanted to reinforce the pinks in this scene. I can maybe drag it more towards a little bit of a magenta. And so far, so you can see here's before and after, it's definitely looking much more color graded. Now, if I want to see some inspiration, I want to see what else I could get out of the color grade, I'll regularly just kind of drag around the color wheels and see what different effects I can get. So for example, let's see, what does a little bit more red give me? A little bit more blue, I also like that. How about the highlights? Instead of going for yellow to warm things up, let me actually go opposite the magenta or the red. And let me go a little bit more towards cyan and green. And so even though you would think you'd never want to add a cyan or green to a skin tone, it is actually a complementary color and it totally works in this example. So what I do is while I'm shooting, while I am tethering, I pick a color grade that inspires me, something that I think is working. But because I'm simply adjusting a preset on a raw file, it can always change my mind and reset later before I do the retouching. So I'm really liking what this kind of cyan green in the highlights as well as the magenta in the shadows is doing for me. And so I'm going to lock that in place and go back to our next effect. All right, so unusual modifiers, unusual filter, color grading. And so one more thing I can play around with if I want is the reflections. Now I already have the reflections on the plexiglass in front of her. When I am photographing this, I know that the distance and angle of my camera makes a huge difference. If I'm shooting at a higher angle, I see more of the reflection. If I'm shooting at a lower angle, I see less. I have to pay attention to the reflections if there's anything around the room. So that's one way I can play with the reflection. And the other is using a tool called the Lens Baby Omni. Now, typically that is something you screw onto the front of your lens, and it will hold different creative reflections in place. So you could have like a prism or a mirror or something called stretch glass. But I've grabbed one of the pieces of reflective material from their reflection expansion pack, and I'm going to simply hold it. Now obviously that means I'm kind of holding the camera with one hand and the reflection with the other, but it gives me some interesting flexibility. So I want to show you the type of creative effect that I can get with this somewhat translucent reflective surface. Now we have all the pieces of the equation working together, and it's time to get the shot. Time to get the right pose and the composition and the heart in the right place behind the head, because no matter what little adjustments I make, it's going to change the way that the light looks both on the subject and behind her. So I'm going to take some time to get that perfect shot. All right, would you mind helping me with the optical spot? I love the images that we got, and you can see I'm using so many different pieces of creativity, from creative modifiers and filters and reflections and color grading. That's what I love about this, is when you know all these different tools available to you, when you layer them up on top of each other, it gives you endless creative variations. So if you'd like to see the gear used in the making of these images, be sure to check out the links in the description below, and of course visit adorama.com. And if you've enjoyed this video and you want to see more just like this one, be sure to like and subscribe. See you next time, guys.